We have a wonderful Pope, Francis, a Jesuit. We have two brilliant Jesuits here at St. Peter, and we've been very blessed to have them for the Jesuits here for so long. And today, we have for you another Jesuit who, after reading and listening to him, I believe you are going to hear some very good news. Our guest speaker today, Father Orobator, is Dean and Professor of the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University. He joined the Jesuits in 1986 and was ordained in 1998. He has served as Provincial Superior of the Jesuits of the Eastern Africa Province and has taught theology and religious studies at Hekima University, Nairobi, Kenya, St. Augustine College of South Africa in Johannesburg, and Marquette University in Milwaukee. A member of the Board of Trustees of Loyola Marymount University, Dean Orobator is also the author of Theology Brewed in an African Pot, Religion and Faith in Africa, and The Pope and the Pandemic. He recently received the Hubert Walter Award for pioneering peacemaking efforts in South Sudan. Please welcome Father Agbonkhianmeghe E. Orobator.
Thank you very much, Alex, and particularly for pronouncing my first name. I think most people try to avoid it. But it's a real pleasure to be here today. Where I come from in Nigeria, we say when a chicken comes to a land it does not know, it stands on one leg. When a chicken comes to a land it does not know, it stands on one leg. But I'm standing on two legs right now, and that means I feel at home, and I'm very grateful for the hospitality, the warm hospitality that I've received since arriving at the airport, being picked up by Christine and Tim, coming to the Jesuit, meeting with my Jesuit companions, Paul and Tim, and last night's dinner at Cynthia's was just amazing, and the hospitality has been really, really great. Thank you very much. But I also want to thank the members of this committee, the Kennedy Lecture Committee, who invited me to this occasion in memory of the legacy or celebration of the legacy of Joan and Keith Kennedy and the Kennedy family. It's a pleasure to be part of this wonderful experience that's been going on out here for 25 years. And I'm sure there's at least 25 more years of this to come. So thank you all very much. Thank you. A key element of this synodal process concerns the recognition of the ways in which women, especially women religious, are already at the forefront of synodal practices in some of the most challenging social situations. In these contexts, women seek collaborators and can be teachers of synodality in the wider church processes. I've just read you a quote from the working document for the continental stage of the Synod on Synodality. And these words, as I understand them, are really a testament to the undeniable truth that in embodying and living and functioning as a synodal church, that is a church that is founded on the principles of mission, participation, and communion, women are not just passive learners. They are teachers, pioneers, and role models. For this first part of our program this morning, I want to draw some lessons from my experience of being at the Synod on Synodality in 2023 and 2024. Lessons about the gifts of women to the mission and ministry of the church. Now, for the purposes of full disclosure, I would like to make a three-part disclaimer. The first part, the imperative of women's inclusion in ecclesial, ministerial leadership is a deeply held personal conviction. It's a deeply held personal conviction. Because I believe in the revealed and self-evident truth that women and men are created equal in the image and likeness of God. And therefore, any form of exclusion is not only an act of injustice, it is a violation of the wholeness of humanity. You see, I believe that humanity is not a single story. It is a composite narrative of women and men, equality and mutuality flourishing together in the risen Christ. And so for me, the quest for inclusion is really a quest for wholeness, for fullness and goodness as God envisioned it at the dawn of creation. That's the first part. The second part of my disclaimer. I also believe that any organization, no matter what organization, that systematically overlooks, undermines, or excludes the giftedness, the wisdom, the contributions, the talents of more than half its population is a flawed organization, is a dysfunctional organization. And that organization can never be whole or complete or fully functional or integral. My third disclaimer, I am a product of a patriarchal culture. A patriarchal culture where the relative positions of men and women are mapped across an axis of deeply, deeply ingrained gender-based stereotypes, sexism, and discrimination. So I have seen this at work in my own culture, where, as a construct, male members of the family or community or society are favored. But I would add that unfortunately, this is not atypical of our contemporary cultures. We only need to look at instances of discrimination relating, for example, to gender pay gaps, social and political exclusion, all of which creates obstacles to the flourishing of women and men as part of this Imago Dei, created in the image and likeness of God. Part of this disclaimer is a recognition that I am also a convert to Catholicism, to Christianity. And in this, I have seen that some of the exclusion that I experienced, gender-based exclusion that I observed in my own culture and religion, are also present within Catholicism. And I think the excesses of patriarchy, for me, reach a new level within the church. The document I started out with, the document for the continental stage, acknowledges this. And here's a quote from that document. It says, quote, "In a church where almost all decision makers are men, there are few spaces where women can make their voices heard." It continues, "Women remain the majority of those who attend the liturgy and participate in activities, men a minority, yet most decision-making and governance roles are held by men." End of quote. Last year, I was invited by the World Union of Catholic Women's Organizations to share my insights from the Synod on Synodality. And they asked me to talk about this theme, women, their participation in the Synodal Church, responsibilities and ministries in response to the pastoral needs of our times. And as I thought about this theme, I also began to imagine some rather, you might say, unconventional and possibly irreverent rephrasing of some scriptural text to sort of encapsulate my experience at the Synod, to sort of encapsulate the lessons I believe I learned from being at the Synod about the pivotal role of women as teachers, pioneers, role models for how to be a synodal church. So then allow me to mention 4 of these key scripture texts that I believe helps me throw light on this question. Psalm 94, verse 8 to 9. I know this is a Catholic church. We don't bring our Bibles to church. But Psalm 94, 8 to 9, in my rephrasing says, "If today you hear her voice, harden not your hearts." If today you hear her voice, harden not your hearts. For those who may recall, after last year's Synod, or 2023 it is now, there was a synthesis report that was produced that captured the main issues from that synodal experience. This report stated, and I quote, "We should avoid repeating the mistake of talking about women as an issue or as a problem." End of quote. Avoid repeating the mistake of talking about women as an issue or a problem. And during the Synod in 2023 and 2024, I witnessed several women reclaiming their voice, which was often marked by pain and anger and frustration, and defining themselves on their own terms. And so I learned the importance of listening to how women choose to define themselves. For while some say, and I heard this in the synod hall, that they are satisfied with roles that are considered traditional as wives, as mothers, as sisters, complementary to men, I also heard others define themselves differently. As leaders, as ministers, as theologians, as accomplished professionals who believe their vocation extends beyond secular duties and activities to include co-responsibility for leadership and mission and ministry within the church. Women who believe that they have been empowered by their baptismal identity and dignity, and who feel they are called to be co-responsible for life, ministry, and mission within the church. These are women who have heard the call of the working document of the Synod that, quote, "It is necessary for women to participate in the life and leadership of the church," end quote. And so when the Synod came up with this idea that a synodal church, the first act of a synodal church is listening, that listening is an essential component of every aspect of the church. Based on my experience at the Synod, I would say that this act should be applied with preference to women. That is to say, that a synodal church, that is a listening church, is also a discerning church. Discerning with women, not about women, to recognize their treasure for the church. My second verse from the Bible is Genesis chapter 4, verse 9. Genesis 4, verse 9. And here is how I rephrase that for myself. Then God said, "Church, where is your mother? Church, where is your sister?" The document of the Synod for the continental stage portrayed the synodal church as a tent. That is, an expansive but not homogeneous dwelling capable of sheltering all. And I think this metaphor of a tent really exposes the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. In other words, it forces us to think about who is welcomed into the tent and who is not, who has a seat in the tent and who doesn't. And as I thought about that, I remembered the prayer intention of Pope Francis for February 2022. He has monthly prayer intentions. For February 2022, his prayer intention was to pray for women and women's participation in the church. And he said this, and I'm quoting Pope Francis: "What would the church be without religious sisters? without consecrated lay women, the church cannot be understood without them. End quote. But then Francis went ahead and said this, quote, I urge women to fight when in some cases they are treated unfairly. Even within the church, when they serve so much that they are reduced to servitude, at times by men of the church. End quote. Now, I have to say this, that I feel terribly uneasy when I read a statement like this. As an ordained male cleric, I have never had to fight. I have never had to fight for any of the privileges, perks, positions, powers that are ascribed to my clerical position. So why do women have to? Why do women have to? And so the synodal process for me uncovered many, many gaps in ministerial inclusion and highlighted for me the urgency of addressing these disparities. But I also believe that we cannot address these disparities by simply creating more rhetoric that flatters women with lofty titles, but are hardly realized in reality. I believe that a truly synodal church is a church that creates space for everyone, that recognizes the charismatic gifts of all and promotes the ministerial flourishing of everyone, rather than privileging the needs of the elites. People like me, who are in the hierarchy, the academy, or the priesthood. When Pope Francis declares todos, 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 we must take that literally. And it must mean exactly that. All, everyone. My third scripture text is from John chapter 2, verse 5. John chapter 2, verse 5. And this is how I rephrase it. Then Mary said, do whatever she tells you. See, after the last session, the 2023 session of the Synod, Pope Francis identified 10 questions which he said must be addressed by special study commissions. And one of the groups was tasked with addressing the question of theological and canonical questions concerning specific forms of ecclesial ministry. Now, this broad-based mandate of this group included the role of women in the church and their participation in decision-taking in the church, their participation in leadership in the church. This group was charged with studying the question, the issue, the problem of women and ministry in the church. And remember what I said earlier on. Stop talking about women as problem or issue or question. As a human being, I can imagine the frustration and even the humiliation of being constantly considered as a question, an issue, or a problem in my own home. A question that is constantly being referred to special commissions for further explorations for ongoing reflection and eventual maturation. These are exact quotes from the Synod's document. And yet, what we find in the final document of the Synod is a clear statement that in this church, there is more than enough room to receive, to honor, to celebrate the gift that women bring to this church. I was asked once, so what do women want? It's the same mindset. What's the problem? What's the question? What's the issue? What do women want? As a male cleric, I must learn to avoid the temptation to speak for women. And so I cannot answer that question. But I'm convinced that the way forward does not lie in a protracted reformulation of juridical norms. The way forward does not lie in agonizing endlessly over doctrinal definitions of esoteric jargons, like persona, munus, potestas. It's simply about the just fulfillment of the equal baptismal dignity of all the people of God, period. It's that simple. So yes, I have heard this at the Synod Hall. Not every woman feels called to the diaconate. Yes, women do not simply want access to clericalized status. But I also heard that certainly women want to be recognized and accepted as faithful, competent, skilled, active missionary disciples, equal in dignity, empowered to utilize their gifts to serve, worship, and minister within the Church of Christ. Shouldn't we just pave the way for that to happen? The final document affirms that ministry and leadership for women in the church is an open question, remains open for discernment. But I also believe that true change will come from the pews, not from the pulpit. As committed lay women and lay men reclaim their spiritual and baptismal agency and challenge the suffocating stranglehold of clericalism. My final text from the scripture, Matthew chapter 16, verse 15. Matthew 16:15. She said to them, "But who do you yourself say that I am?" So at the risk of indulging in hollow and meaningless rhetoric, I believe, as the title of this reflection states, which is a quote from the synodal document, women are teachers of synodality. And like Mary of Nazareth, they are living models and creative guides for an authentic spiritual synodality. During the synod, I witnessed the invaluable and irreplaceable gifts and contributions of women as leaders and advocates of synodality. And listening to their voices, honoring their gifts, celebrating their competence, and allowing each one to teach us the essence of being a synodal church is something that would simply make us a better church. It is that simple. So here is my concluding thought so we can move to the next part. A lot has been said about Pope Francis's appointment of women to positions of authority and leadership and influence at the Vatican. As recently as the appointment of Sister Raffaella Petrini as the first ever governor of the Vatican State, Sister Simona Brambilla as the first prefect of the Dicastery for Consecrated Life. And I truly, honestly applaud the courage and audacity that Pope Francis has in making these transformative changes. Yet, when we set this action of Francis alongside the fact that the most voted against paragraph of the final document of the Synod on Synodality is paragraph 60, we get a sense of the depth of clericalism that flows in the patriarchal veins of the Church. Now, for those who have not read paragraph 60 of the final document, here is what it says, part of what it says. It says, by virtue of baptism, women and men have equal dignity as members of the people of God. Who could possibly vote against that? By virtue of baptism, women and men have equal dignity as members of the people of God. However, women continue to encounter obstacles in obtaining a fuller recognition of their charisms, vocation, and roles in all the various areas of the Church's life. This is to the detriment of serving the Church's shared mission. Paragraph 60, it continues. There is no reason or impediment that should prevent women from carrying out leadership roles in the Church. Whatever comes from the Holy Spirit cannot be stopped. Additionally, the question of women's access to diaconal ministry remains open, end quote. This is paragraph 60 of the final document, the most voted against paragraph of all the entire document. In this Jubilee year, this is my hope. I long for the day when women serving in positions of ministerial and ecclesial leadership would become the norm, not the exception or headline news. For then and only then, the Pauline promise would have been fulfilled. There's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither slave nor free. There's neither male nor female, for we are all one in Christ. Amen.
You grew up in Benin City, Nigeria, in a family of 25 children and 9 mothers. You practiced traditional African religion, also called animism, until you converted to Catholicism as a teen. The story is that you were visiting the local Jesuit parish in Nigeria for Easter Vigil Mass. So my question is, what was it about that experience with the Jesuits and or the Easter Vigil Mass that led you to such a life-changing decision?
Thank you very much. I remember the occasion as if it were yesterday. I grew up in a very traditional African family. We practiced African religion. And it was an experience that taught me about who God is and, what family means, what community means. I had no connections with the church. My family had no connections with the church. In fact, we were regularly referred to by the Christians as pagans. That was the standard term. We were pagans. And so we had nothing to do with the church. But there was a church across the street from our house. And on this day, late in the evening, I noticed that the lights were on in the church. There was something going on there, quite unusually. And I wandered into this church. And what I saw changed my life, because I didn't know, but it was Easter Vigil. And there was baptism going on. I saw this long line of children all dressed in white. And the whole community was just excited about them. I had no idea what they were doing. I stayed just out of curiosity. And I noticed that it was later knew it was baptism, but they were being baptized. And everyone was so excited about welcoming these children into the community. And when at the end of that event, someone said, well, those who would like to be baptized and welcome into the community should please register in the parish church, I knew that was my calling. And that same week, without asking anybody in my family or talking to anybody, I showed up in the parish church. I met a Jesuit priest, Toni Tupponce, and between the two of us, we managed to understand that I wanted to be enlisted in the catechism class, and that's how it started for me.
Thank you, Father. I hope you all can hear me as well. I want to say at the out front some of the conversation we had last night as I listened to your reflection. If you gave that reflection at my home church here in Charlotte, it would take you a lot longer to get through it, because there would have been a lot of amens, a lot of clapping, right? A lot of standing up, a lot of ashes going on. And I restrained myself as I sat in that front row, because I promised that I would not embarrass the family. But thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I want to pick up a little bit on what Tim said as he asked you about what brought you to your conversion. And start a little bit with the term that you were seeing and the practice was seeing as pagan, because that is such a, for me, a Western kind of term, and it is not a positive one. Did you feel, though you were not connected to a church, that you and your family were not connected to God, regardless of what you may have called him or her?
Thanks, Toni. Thanks, that's a very important question. You know, one of the things I'm very grateful for today, as a Jesuit, as a Christian, is that Christianity came long after I knew God. That's very important for me, because the Christianity came for me long after I knew God. In my family, we practiced African religion. And that meant in the homestead, there were many deities, many altars dedicated to several deities. You had a sense in which you were surrounded by divinity. You lived with divinity. There was no disconnection between the sacred and the profane. It was all together. And that's what shaped our understanding of faith, of religion, of worship, of ritual, of sacrifice, of God. And so I was deeply, deeply steeped in this consciousness of who God is for me and for my family. And so when Christianity came and I embraced Christianity, I didn't feel that I was discovering something that I already didn't have. In a way, it just threw more light on an experience that I already had. Yes, we were called pagans. I was called a pagan. But as I think about it now, it just matters little to me what I was called. Because whether or not I was recognized as a Christian, I knew that God recognized me, and I recognized God because of the experience I had growing up in African traditional religion.
Father, the Catholic Church is shrinking in Europe and in the United States, but it is growing by leaps and bounds in Africa, a continent you know well. You grew up in Nigeria, you lived in Kenya, you were in charge of the Jesuits in East Africa. Why so much growth in the church there and in the global South generally, would you say?
I think when we think growth, of course, we count bodies. We count, who are converting, who are those converting, and how many people are being baptized and received into the church, and we do statistics. But I don't think God does statistics. And here's why I think that way. Where I come from, yes, statistically, there is growth. And how do you explain this? If I draw on my experience, one thing that stands out is that the religion flows in our veins. In my experience of growing up, as I said, I was surrounded. Mm-hmm. I had a deep consciousness that I wasn't alone in this universe. Every object, whether animate or inanimate, was considered to be charged with some spirit. And so there's already that deeply ingrained consciousness that people carry with them. That is the bedrock that Christianity builds upon. For me, that explains a lot. It's not that people are more religious or people care more about their faith. It's just that at the depth of at the core of their being, there is a very strong awareness of spirituality, of who God is. And this for me counts for a lot. So it's not just the number of bodies, it's the depth of conviction that allows people to self-identify as religious or Christian.
Now you're in the United States, why is it shrinking here? Why are those numbers shrinking here? Do you read anything into that?
Well, I can't explain why it's shrinking here. I don't want to presume too much, but I've been told, and from my own reading and studies, that a lot has to do with how society evolves. That the society becoming more secularized. But let's not discount the fact that the credibility of the Christian community has also suffered serious problematic instances of, you might think of abuse cases, for example. Sure. You might think of lack of accountability, for example, or transparency. People pay attention to that. When we fail to model the gospel in a way that we're supposed to as a Christian community, I'd imagine that's something that would turn people off.
Right. Next Pope, I'm telling you.
I've never heard that said better. Thank you so much for that. And we'll get back to Africa in just a minute. But again, from the conversation that we shared at that table last night, you may have sensed that I'm probably in my old age moving towards a womanist theology on a personal level. And as I listen to you today, I try to avoid that part of me who is a singer, that part of me that has lyrics in my head all the time. But this kept coming back to me. There's a song, a liberation song by a group called Sweet Honey in the Rock. And there's a line in it, it's my favorite line. And it says something like, I'm a woman and I speak with one voice, and I must be heard. At times I can be quite difficult. I'll bow down to no man's word. We who believe in freedom shall not rest. People who know it will know the rest of it. But we won't rest until it comes. And so as I heard you speak about the Holy Father's words and his thought and how difficult that had to be during the Synod, what do you think will happen next? If you could have some sense of what might happen from all that you've experienced and been a part of, what might happen for Catholic women whose hopes have been dashed? Some were very angry about what didn't happen in the Synod.
Thank you very much. One of the things I realized was that the synod or the synodal process raised a lot of hopes and expectations. But when you look at how synods work, synods are really an advisory body to the Pope on issues of consequence in the church. Synods don't make decisions, at least as we conceive them in this particular context. They advise the Pope on issues that are of relevance, that the Pope thinks are of relevance. And so I think the expectation was that the Synod was going to answer every single question. And when that didn't happen, I can understand the frustration and the disappointment. I have written elsewhere that we could have a synod on every one of those 10 issues that Pope Francis identified, and we could still be going on for the next 100 years. But here's what I believe is important. The synod opens the way and invites us to do the rest. I just quoted that paragraph 60, which when you look closely at it, really sounds revolutionary. When you read it closely, when it says that what the Spirit has begun cannot be withstood, about women and participation in leadership and ministry, that I consider to be a strong mandate for every baptized believer to claim their rights and their position in the church. I believe that firmly. And as I said, I don't believe that that change is going to come from the pulpit. It has to come from the pews. There is an agency we need to claim. It's spiritual, it's baptismal. And what the Synod does is empower us to do just that. That this is of the Spirit, that we can be co-responsible for the mission and life and ministry of the church without having to excuse ourselves, bow to someone else, but realizing that this is what God calls us to. I think I appreciate and I know the disappointment, but I also believe in the mandate of the Synod that's for us to do. Notice that Pope Francis said he will not write an apostolic exhortation. Why? Because he believes that what's come out of the Synod is enough, in his words, to guide action. He believes that. And he even went further to say that this document is now part of the official teaching of the Catholic Church. And so everything that is there is to be done. And the responsibility now falls on us as a Christian community to begin to envisage ways in which we make this real. I see this as a mandate. It's not a closure. And that should be empowering for every one of us.
We acknowledged in an earlier conversation that there is still a sense of otherness that exists in the culture of our church. And as a Black American, that matters to me. There were also hopes that the Synode's final document would call for some radical inclusion, an end to some more otherness, if you will, of at least more welcoming approach towards LGBTQ and divorced and remarried Catholics. The final document was somewhat silent there. But at least those issues for the first time were discussed at the Synod. What might come next there as well?
Thank you. Again, here is another area where I think as a church we continue to struggle. If synodality means what it says, that is mission, participation, communion, it implies that everyone is welcome in this space. But the reality is different. The question you just raised about LGBTQ was on the table at the Synod. And in fact, the preparatory document referenced this question explicitly. But the reality is, we're a community that continues to struggle with our sins, one of which is homophobia. We continue to struggle with this. As a church, there are parts in our community that refuse to acknowledge that when we say we are created in the image and likeness of God, that's not a single story. We are created in our own unique ways. And the LGBTQ community, as I have written somewhere, is also a manifestation of the image and likeness of God. There are people who don't believe that. But because we all form part of the same community, it becomes difficult how we bring everybody together. What the Synod revealed was that there's still deep tension and deep division around this particular question. And so what came out of it was more or less a compromise to talk about inclusion in other ways rather than explicitly naming those who are excluded. And part of the argument was that there are so many who are not included. We couldn't possibly name all of them. Can we at least create a room for everybody to feel welcome? So I don't think the question is closed, but it was important that we heard stories at the Synod about what it means to be a member of the LGBTQ community. When people say, as some people have said, oh, we don't have gay people in Africa, we don't have homosexuals in Africa, that's a lie. That's a big lie. And one of the things that happened at the Synod was the opportunity for everybody gathered to hear stories, personal stories, about people's lives as members of the LGBTQ community. And to begin to pay attention that we're not talking about an acronym, you see. There was deep objection to the use of LGBTQ. We're not talking about an acronym. We're talking about people, lives. We're talking about human beings. And for people to hear that and to see that was really significant. And that's why I keep saying, we've opened a path. Now we must walk that path.
So, as a follow-up to that, Father, you and others have said that the recent synod was a beginning that it could pave the way for doing church differently, to truly turn it into a listening church instead of one that mostly sends down edicts. Will this push to modernize the church live on when Francis is gone?
Well, my wish, my hope is that Francis will be with us for many, many more years to come. That's my wish, that's my prayer. It's interesting you use the word architect. I think when you look at masterpieces, architectural masterpieces, they have a way of outliving their creators. And that's what I hope for synodality. I have heard of people who are actively praying for the demise of Pope Francis. That's really sad. But I am convinced that what he has begun or initiated will gradually begin to grow roots across the entire landscape of Catholicism. And that these roots will be strong enough to bear the weight of what is to come after Pope Francis.
Can synodality also change the way we do things at the local level, in our diocese, in our parishes? And what can people in the pews do if the local bishop or pastor aren't on board? And for the record, I have to say that is not the case here at St. Peter's, and I think our new bishop is pro-synod too. But I know, looking around the country, there are a lot of priests and bishops that are not on board for synodality. What would you advise local Catholics?
Well, similar to what I said earlier on, I think the agency belongs to the people of God. One of the things the Synod stressed over and over again is that we, as a church, are the people of God. It doesn't matter whether you're ordained or not, everybody belongs to this community called the people of God. And therefore, when you read the documents of the Synod, it's very clear. That's a mandate for each person to take responsibility or to participate in co-responsibility for the mission and ministry of the church. And I think it's good that we look up to our bishops, to our priests and cardinals to lead the way. But the reality is, if anything is really going to change, we have to be the initiators. Synodality is about becoming church at the level where we are. And I think that agency is something we should never cede to any authority. But because of the synodal process, we reclaim this agency and we define how we will live as a community. That's the mandate from the Synod.
Power to the people.
Father, you've spoken, and I don't like to repeat things that you've already spoken about, but I've so enjoyed your reflections on Pope Francis and his humanity, his being a real person, down to earth. My brief reflection on our new bishop is that he appears at least to be a man of the people and very able to get to know people where they truly are. But in light of that, and as you said a few minutes ago, there are actually some people, I can't even imagine it, but I've heard it too, who pray for, look forward to the demise of the Holy Father. And with all the things that he's done and his appointments of new cardinals, do you think the next pope will be as reform-minded and as globally minded as Pope Francis?
Well, thank you. I haven't seen the movie Conclave, And I hear that it's a lot of political intriguing and scheming around the election of a pope. And I know that the topic of, the next pope is always a hotly debated question with gossips and all kinds of innuendos. What I can say is that I truly believe that this is God's domain. I say that because when you think of Pope Francis and his election as the first pope from the global south, that's not something we expected. And whatever expectations we had of how he would turn out, we realize now that he has really, in many ways, surprised many people. His boldness, his courage, his audacity to call for change and actually lead change, that's the work of the Holy Spirit. So I believe that whoever the next pope is going to be, or wherever that pope is going to come from, that same spirit will be at work. And I know that that same spirit will want to continue the good work. I can say this, that same spirit will want to continue the good work that Pope Francis has initiated. I think I can say that with a level of certitude that, God is in charge here. Yeah.
Father, in the United States at least, recent reports say that most of the new priests coming out of seminary seem to have a nostalgia for a pre-Vatican II church that they never experienced. Many of them seem to see themselves as princes of the church rather than shepherds with the, quote, stink of the sheep on them, as Pope Francis, an outspoken critic of clericalism, has put it. What happens and will happen when these new priests seek to lead Catholics in the pews who are maybe not as enamored with the Latin Mass and other relics of the church? And you're a dean at a theology school. I'm sure you see some of this out there, even though it's California.
Thank you. Well, what I can say is that I think for me, given the experience I've had of synodality, it's critically important that we don't speak of us and them. It's really one church. And I believe that if synodality is to really become what we expect it to be, that we recognize that we don't see things the same way and we don't do things the same way. But we should be ready and prepared to call one another to question. The situation you referenced about people who feel they are princes and privileged in the church, that seems to me an aberration. And that's something we should call to question. That seems to me something we should try to transform. And the way we do that for me is not only to listen, but also to show what it looks like to be a servant leader, as Pope Francis would encourage us to be, to show what does that look like. We need to be able to model that for people to see that this is an alternative that is also viable and is probably preferable. So without wanting to condemn or disparage anybody's preference or proclivity, I would say that we need to invite people to see other ways of being leaders that is fulfilling and gratifying too, and not just confined to one closed model of leadership in the church.
I'm looking at a question that I have. I want to change it just a little bit in the moment. I'm not sure what is taught today in the Church of the United States. about our church's past and its connection, for example, to enslavement. But it is an unspoken, troubling thing that happens, that occurs within the Black American community as we try to bring more people into the church and convincing those who know that history. My question is twofold. What, if anything, is taught about that in the African church as we're bringing people in? And secondly, what do you think can be done to help bring more Black Americans into the church now that we don't have as many schools in our communities? Our churches are closing, to bring more African Americans into the church, because while Africans seem to be growing, Black Americans within the church are decreasing.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to acknowledge I'm a Jesuit, and I want to acknowledge the fact that as a Jesuit, I share in that history that you just referenced. I'm quite familiar with a bit of the history of Jesuit involvement in slavery. I was a board member of Georgetown University at some point, so I got to know about the 1838 sale of people of African descent, 272 of them, to the South to save the university. So I'm aware of that, and that's something that fills me with, as a Jesuit, with a lot of shame and regret and remorse. It's easy to say, well, I'm not an American, I'm not a US Jesuit, but I'm a Jesuit. We form one family globally, and so that's something that I share in. But I'm also aware of what the Jesuits are trying to do in reaching out to descendants, to the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, which again gives us a model of going forward. In terms of recognizing first the evil that was committed, and then finding ways to chart a new path forward. But here's the thing that I find critical. That's not something that the Jesuits should do alone, or the church should do alone. That's something that calls us to, with all humility, learn from those who have been deeply affected by this, who know what it feels like to carry this burden of history, of enslavement, to learn and to take the cue from them. How shall we move forward? Whether it's reparation, reconciliation, truth-telling, whatever that means, restitution, that's something we should be learning. So in a way, the learning shouldn't be coming from the official channels. The learning should be coming from those who actually know what it feels like to be in this space. So I think there's work to be done. And then you talk about how do we make this space called the Catholic Church open and attractive to more African Americans. You have to see yourself in this community. And if you're not seeing yourself in this community, that's going to be very tough. I like to think of the church as a group photograph. What in French they say, photo de famille, a group photograph. And when I see a group photograph, what do I look for first? I look for where I sit or stand in that group photo. I look for myself. And if people are not seeing themselves represented in the church, it's going to be very difficult. So I would like to see a way in which, in terms of how we promote vocations, for example, to religious life, to priesthood, to consecrated life, that we are intentional in reaching out to particular communities and supporting vocation from particular communities. Because when we're able to do that and people see themselves represented in this community, it makes you feel more affiliated, at home with, closer to this community. I think there are ways in which we can do this, and I would like to think that one of those ways is being intentional about promoting vocation to religious life, to priesthood, to religious vocations generally, that are tailored to the needs of particular communities.
Another Jesuit question, Father. Our Kennedy lecture speaker last year, reporter Paul Eli of The New Yorker, went to Fordham University and now has a job at Georgetown, 2 Jesuit schools. Many of us here have benefited from a fine Jesuit education. But because of the shortage of priests in the United States, Eli said it's now possible to get a Jesuit education without actually meeting a Jesuit. We also love our Jesuit priests, past and present here at St. Peter's, but we wonder how long we can keep them because of this shortage. What is your sense of the Jesuits' future as an order? And again, you're a dean of a theology school at a Jesuit university.
I would have to say, honestly, the future of the Jesuits, for me, is promising. And here's why I say that. I know people will say, well, there's growth in the global south. You know, by 2030, more than half the number of Jesuits in the world will come from 2 regions in the world. That's from South Asia, mostly India, and Africa. More than 50% of the Jesuits will come from this region. And that's a growing part of the world. Now, that's not why I say the future is promising. See, when we talk about Jesuits, what the Jesuits represents is an apostolic body of people, Jesuits, women and men, who have been introduced to and who believe in the Ignatian ideals, Jesuit Ignatian values. So why has the Society of Jesus thrived and succeeded for so long? It's not really down to the number of Jesuits. It's down to the fact that, as an apostolic body, there are women and men who have imbibed the Jesuit ideals and who are able not only to interpret this, but to live it out in the world. If you look at Jesuit higher education today in the US, there are 27 Jesuit colleges and universities. And by my last count, there were 3 Jesuit presidents. All the other 24 are led by lay women and laymen. And several of them are thriving. And these are laymen and lay women who have embraced the Ignatian ideal and are therefore not only able to interpret it, but to live it out. I come from Santa Clara University, where we have a lay woman president, the first in the history of the university, President Julie Sullivan. And I tell you, if I had to choose a president for a university who understands Ignatian ideals and values and who lives them out, I would choose President Julie Sullivan over anybody else, Jesuit or non-Jesuit. So when I say the future is promising, it's because we have people, lay women and men, who have embraced what St. Ignatius gave to the church as a gift, Ignatian spirituality. And these are the people who will continue the legacy of the Society of Jesus long after the last Jesuit has switched off the lights. So I'm very hopeful about that. And I think as a Society of Jesus, that's something we need to commit to. Formation of colleagues and partners and collaborators in Ignatian spirituality, and who will carry on this legacy because they believe in this, in the values and principles of this spirituality.
Thank you.
So they may never meet a Jesuit in their formation, but they will meet many people who are Ignatian
Yeah.
So my last question, Father, takes us back both to Africa and then to your writing, right? See all my little tags, I'm not faking
I
it.
see that.
I hope that everyone will, if they don't get your books today, that they get them. Shameless plug, you're not paying me for that. But I say that because I was so excited about in what I read. And then in one of your books, African Ecological Ethics and Spirituality for Cosmic Flourishing, you talk about the wisdom of African religious traditions and its connectedness to our life, to everything around us. Do you think then that which others may have called paganism goes hand in hand with saving our world as we see God in everything in our world?
Well, thank you. Thanks,
We're in
Toni.
trouble.
Thank you very much. Again, you're right. I think there's a particular kind of sensitivity to the world around us that I was gifted with by my African religious experience and tradition. See, I told you earlier on that where I grew up, we were surrounded by all forms and manner of representation of spirituality and religiosity. But that also meant that we believed, and I still believe, that there is no single entity on this planet that is not charged or alive by a special spirit. I believe that. And so it was always critical to pay attention to how you related to the rest of nature. Whether it was a tree, a rock, or a body of water, there was some spirit there. And you treated it with respect. You treated it with respect. You don't just cut down a tree unless you had a reason for it. And in some instances, you would ask for permission to do that. There was a lot of herbal medicine when I was growing up. And when you go to collect herbs, herbalists go to collect herbs, they explain to the plant why they are doing this. Because the belief was that if you didn't, it would not be efficacious. You needed the cooperation of this element for this to work for you. Because if you didn't, it wouldn't work. So there's that sensitivity, and I think that's what, as an African who's grown up in this tradition, I still carry with me. And I hope that as a world, as a universe, we recognize this. There's a sense in which much of what I practice now in terms of my ecological sensitivity comes from my background. I'll tell you this, and I don't mean this in any negative sense. One of the things that surprises me and baffles me now, where I live, when I see the amount of waste we generate on a single day. I mean, when I look at the trash cans in my school, every single day, when I leave the building, I am amazed how much waste is generated. And I ask myself, how is this possible to do this? We talk about reduce, recycle, and reuse. And, in my experience, when you bought something, say you bought a box of cookies growing up, the most valuable part of that gift is the container. Is the container. You're always thinking, what can I do with this container? Not even the cookies inside, is the container. So there's a sense in which you learn to value reducing your carbon footprint, the amount of waste you produce, and how you relate with that delicate balance between humans and nature that is respectful. that I think this form of religious tradition teaches us today. And there's a lot we can learn from that. And I hope we do, because we could be in real crisis, trouble, if we don't.
Blessed are the peacemakers, Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount. You recently were given an award by the Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury for your leadership of a 2019 retreat at the Vatican for politicians on opposing sides of South Sudan's civil war. Talk about what that was like. I want to get that anecdote about the Pope in there. And what does your experience tell you about the power of ecumenism and interfaith cooperation, especially in pursuit of peace?
Thank you. I do believe that as a Christian community, or Christian communities, there's a lot we can do for our world if we cooperate and work together. The event you just referenced in 2019 was actually an initiative of the Anglicans. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, was the one who conceived of this idea, because he realized that all these warlords who are trying to kill one another, they're all Christians. What if we just brought them together and said, well, just pray and talk about your prayer? And that's what led to the event at the Vatican. And Justin Welby was there, Pope Francis was there, the moderator of the Scottish Presbyterian Church was there. It was the three of them working together to bring these warring factions together in the same room for the first time to pray and talk to one another. And for me, that was certainly a manifestation of the power of ecumenical initiative. When we think about ecumenism, we're always thinking about, documents that, groups come together and they write, But this is practical ecumenism of action. Churches coming together to make a difference in the lives of people. And for me, that will remain one of the most meaningful, impactful experiences of my life.
And Muslims, Hindus, Jews, are they part of the equation you discovered?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Tell me about what the Pope did. You thought he was going to give a speech.
So we asked Pope Francis, as during this program in the Vatican, his role was to come in at the end, give an exhortation, encourage the warlords to work towards peace and reconciliation, and give them a Bible, each one of them a Bible, as a sign of peace. And that was the plan that we had. True to character, Francis surprised everyone. At the end, he stood up and knelt down in front of every one of them, all 7 of them, and kissed their feet. He kissed the feet of every single one of them. And you could see them, they were visibly moved, some were in tears as this happened. And that's the kind of person we have as a leader.
Amen.
Who can stoop low and kiss the blood-stained feet of others, because he believes this is the way to make peace.
Which writers or saints or prayers do you look to as avenues to deepen your faith, or any African sayings? We need recommendations as we march out of church today.
Well, this is probably not what you expect as an answer, but there are people whose lives I think have been very impactful for me. I think of people like Nelson Mandela from South Africa, and what he did for the continent and for the country. That continues to be for me a huge inspiration, and is someone that I find a lot of inspiration in. This will not surprise you, but I've repeated this again and again. Pope Francis, I believe, is a gift to the church, and I'm really excited by what he represents, and I find him inspirational.
Speaking of Pope Francis, he recently sent cordial greetings and the assurance of my prayers to President Trump on Inauguration Day, but the pontiff has also been quoted as saying that mass deportations would be a disgrace. I know you don't want to get political, but what should the Catholic bishops in this country and we Catholics in the pews be? A lot of Catholics voted for President Trump. I mean, what should be our attitude toward this issue, that's really playing out in the news every day now?
I believe we have a tradition of social engagement. It's called Catholic social teachings. And I think it gives us values and principles and criteria for judgment and for action. And they are around issues of justice, respect for human dignity, protection of the weak. And I do hope that as Catholics, whether as leaders or as members of the community, we're able to stand up for these values in these times. I think these times call for that kind of witnessing. There are people who are scared. There are people who are anxious. There are people who are afraid. And for the purposes of full disclosure, I am a migrant worker. I hold a migrant worker visa. So I feel a sense of that anxiety and that fear of what might happen. As Christians, I would hope that we will be in the image and likeness of God, protectors of the weak, comfort of the afflicted, and defenders of the persecuted, here and now. This is a moment that calls for witnessing.
So, let me ask you one last question. It used to be, maybe when I was growing up, I guess, and before, that European and American missionaries would go into Africa to, convert the natives or the pagans, whatever the colonistic terms were at the time. Now you're seeing a lot of African priests come to the United States because we have a shortage of priests. What kind of mindsets are they bringing here, and how can they change and affect the Catholic Church in our country, do you think?
Well, I would hope that they bring also gifts from their own traditions to enrich the life of the Catholic community in the U.S. I would also hope that that mindset is one that is open to learning ways of being community and church here. What am I saying? I'm saying there has to be mutuality. I serve as the dean of a Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, California, Santa Clara University. I know I bring particular gifts, but over the last year and a half, I've learned a lot. And I acknowledge that. I think it's that mutuality that needs to happen so that we are always drawing from the gifts of one another. Right. And that's what builds community.
Thank you.
Tim, thank you. Toni, thank you.